Hey guys, Political Junkie 2414 here, and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be updating my 2026, or providing, an updated look at my 2026 Senate predictions. The midterms are just 9 months away now, so I'm really looking forward to covering this more in depth. This is the first prediction I have done for all of election year, and this will be my prediction for the start of the month of February. I will also start to make some governor predictions and Senate predictions, or House predictions in the future. So watch out for that. But overall, I think it's about time. I think the last Senate prediction video I made was probably July of last year. So more, it's been over 6 months, almost seven. Um, and we are going to, a lot has changed in these races. So we're going to get right to it and look at what has changed in a lot of these races. So we're going to go pretty fast. We'll fill out the safe Democratic states, Oregon, Illinois, Colorado. These are the usual suspects. Delaware, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Virginia, I am going to move into the likely or the safe Democratic column. And I don't remember actually if I had Colorado as a likely Dem state last time. I'm pretty sure I had it. It might have been likely Dem at the time. So I think Colorado and Virginia, Virginia at the very least, I know was likely. Um, these states used to be competitive, but have pretty much drifted towards the Democratic Party pretty heavily. Virginia, of course, had its little thing with Glenn Youngkin. It had a pretty good, it was a good year for Republicans in 2021. But the Democrats have done relatively well there. Ever since, and in 2025, they had a great night with Abigail Spanberger, blew out Winsome Sears. Um, which I by a larger margin than a lot of people thought. They won a supermajority in the House of Delegates, and Mark Warner isn't really facing the same level of opposition that he has in previous elections. Now, I will say he did underperform a little bit in 2020. He only, he was supposed to win. This was not a race that was supposed to be this close, but it wasn't even really that close. I mean, 12 points for Democrat in Virginia, not bad whatsoever. But it was, it was a bit underwhelming compared to what some of the polls were saying. Um, Overall, though, I think Warner, he's not really facing a lot, as much. He doesn't have any big, names jumping in. Glenn Youngkin's not running. Jason Miyares, the recently ousted attorney general, is not running. And Bryce Reeves, who I believe was the only real, candidate with a lot of name recognition. He was a state senator. He decided recently to drop out of the race, and that got a lot of national attention because it really shifted Virginia in a lot of people's minds to being safe for the Democratic Party. So yeah, that is it right now for the safe Democratic states. For the safe Republican states, there are more. These are the usual suspects you would imagine: the Deep South, the Rocky Mountains. Um, Overall, I would say the only change that I can think of would probably be, well, I think Nebraska honestly was a safe Republican seat last time I did this. Dan Osborne has jumped into the race. He was the same independent that came out that almost, or didn't almost, but put up a very impressive showing against Deb Fisher in 2024. Caught Fisher and National Republicans sleeping, and Democrats backed him. They decided we're not going to run a candidate in this race. This is a prime example of why, independent Senate bids, while ultimately very rarely succeed unless you're Angus King or Bernie Sanders. Um, they can be really, they can really force the national party, or the party that the state in question picks nationally, to really focus on a race. And it worked for Democrats. It really helped. Well, I don't know if I'd say it worked, because they didn't win it, and Republicans did overperform in some of these races. But it definitely, in an election where Democrats won, Senate seats, held on to four in states that Trump won simultaneously on the ballot. I'm sure that it helps some. So I think Dan Osborne, he doesn't have the element of surprise this time, but he is doing, he still is going up, in the same state. He has, a lot of name recognition. Democrats have once again agreed not to run a candidate in this race. So I think overall, this race is going to be interesting. But as to whether or not it's really competitive, like it, or has the same potential to be as close as it was last time, I don't really think so. I think I think really Pete Ricketts is a better Senate, or just a better Senate candidate, than really Deb Fisher was. Was governor of Nebraska. He won his election by a whopping 25 points, but then again, Democrats did not contest this whatsoever. He even outperformed Trump, which was pretty unusual for a Senate candidate in 2024. Most Republicans candidates were riding his coattails, not to say that they wouldn't have won on their own, but still, Ricketts was unique in that regard, or I don't know if I call him unique, but, a rarity. So, and also Florida. This is a one that I am going to change. Alexander Vindman has just jumped in on the Democratic side. If you know anything about the Vindmans, Eugene Vindman is a congressman from Virginia. They were both veterans. Alexander, big Trump foe, very prominent, in terms of evidence, or in terms of testifying before Congress before it impeached Trump for the first time in 2019. So Vindman, he's got a lot of name recognition. Republicans here, they have locked down, the Republican primary. That was a bit of a concern, for Ashley Moody in the beginning because it looked like some Republicans might consider jumping into the race. Some Republicans who DeSantis decided not to pick to succeed Marco Rubio, who previously held the state. This is a special election, by the way. This is a seat that Marco Rubio won in 2022, but he resigned to be Secretary of State, so therefore we're having a special election this year. So whoever runs in this seat, and same for Ohio with J.D. Vance resigning, whoever wins this seat's going to have to run again in 2028, because the seat will be up again. So Ashley Moody, she is the Attorney General from this, or was the Attorney General from the state. She's the new appointee. Typically, appointed senators don't do as well, have a bit more weakness. Um, Electorally speaking, but Moody has overperformed DeSantis in both of her elections. She's doing, she won by, over 20 points, I think, in 2022. She's, going to lock down this race, and I think Vindman, Democrats, in Florida, they really try and push their candidates to victory. They really rake in huge fundraising, but at the end of the day, Florida's just really shifted really hard right. And while they have had success here with the Miami mayoral race, last year, they won it for the first time in 30 years. I still think it's Florida. It's still a pretty red state. I think this state is definitely not a swing state anymore. And so I think Moody will, this isn't a state to really watch for Democrats. I think Ohio will be a lot more interesting, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. New Jersey, Cory Booker, I think is going to be fine. This is, this is not a change. Mikey Sherrill did a hell of a lot better than anyone was expecting in 2025. She really beat Jack Ciattarelli despite running a pretty mediocre campaign. Um, and a lot of the gains that Trump had made in historically Democratic areas, like Passaic County, um, were erased by Sherrill. And so, while I think that shows that New Jersey, like in the past, it has a tendency to kind of jump, has swing back a lot, but it's still a pretty clearly Democratic state. And I think Cory Booker, not necessarily, someone who's going to overperform by a huge ton compared to other Democratic candidates, but I think he's fine. And I think Republicans don't really have a clear candidate to run here. I could even consider putting this in safe, but for right now, I am going to keep it, on the high end of likely. New Mexico as well. Ben Ray Lujan, he kind of underperformed in 2020. He only won by 6 when Biden won the state by 11. Harris won the state by a little bit less than she probably should have. She won it by like 6, I want to say, and Martin Heinrich, I mean, he did pretty well in comparison. But I don't really see Republicans. They don't really seem to have a clear candidate here. I could even put this in safe, but New Mexico is rarely that high. Its margin of victory for Democrats is rarely that high, so I'm going to keep it likely. And the last likely state for the Democrats, I think, will be Minnesota. This is a state that I considered. I went back and forth between putting it in lean and likely over the last couple months because of the retirement of Tina Smith and the primary that's happening between Peggy Flanagan and Angie Craig. In terms of electability, I think Angie Craig is better. I think that she has won a swing district by a huge amount in 2024. This it's not well. I wouldn't call Minnesota's second district really a swing district anymore, but it is blue leaning, competitive, but generally likely Democratic. Peggy Flanagan, on the other hand, um, I think she will be the nominee. I think that she connects more with Democratic voters, but she is she's not been elected in her own right yet, so that could be interesting. Republicans do have Michelle Tafoya, who is a retired sports broadcaster reporter, um, not a broadcaster but a reporter, and she has the backing of national Republicans. I think it'll make this race a little that she'll she might you know help Republicans from having, keep Republicans from having a, brutal primary. But honestly, I don't really think Republicans have much of a chance in Minnesota. I think it looked a lot better a couple months ago, but the ICE raids have just been horrendous around the state for this, for the GOP electorally. This has turned into a huge issue. And is part of the reason why we're in a, partial government shutdown this weekend. Um, but it's the big reason why we're in the shutdown this weekend. And so I think Democrats really, I was a bit concerned. I would have been a little bit concerned for the Democrats after the fraud scandal, and it looked a lot worse a month ago for the party, before these ICE raids started. After that, I think, Democrats, they have Amy Klobuchar in the governor's race. That's going to help them. She is the one constant in their state's politics over the last 20 years. And Peggy Flanagan, I think she'll do all right in this race. I don't think this is a race the Democrats really have to worry about that much. Um, and so, in terms of Iowa, I'm going to put this in the likely red category. Joni Ernst is retiring, and I think that's a good thing for the GOP because she had terrible political instincts and she underperformed Trump in 2020. She still, she did a lot better than what people expected her to, granted. Um, but she still underperformed, and she said to that crowd, I don't know if I'm sure you've all seen the video by now, but you know, you're she basically mocked her supporters who mocked constituents who were concerned about Medicaid cuts that were being included in the big beautiful bill, and she just seemed generally unhappy with the Senate. She would have been vulnerable to a Democratic challenger, and Democrats in the governor's race this year, they have Rob Sand, the auditor of Iowa, running. So I think that's really good for the GOP, or for the Democrats, especially in some of the House races. But for the Senate, I really don't think Democrats. This is not as promising of a pickup as it looked a couple of weeks ago. This is a state still that Trump won by 13 points, and so I think no one was really expecting it to flip just yet. But I think um, Ashley Hinson, as the Republican candidate, she has really locked down this primary. Um, she has Trump's endorsement. She has Senate Republicans, the Senate Republican leadership's endorsement. Meanwhile, Democrats have a pretty, wacky primary here. I think Zach Walz, the former state Senate minority leader, he will probably be the candidate. But you have a lot going on here, and I think Iowa in general, it's still a red state. A lot of Democrats, have been saying it could be competitive. There's been a lot of um, special elections in Iowa over the last year since Trump was elected, and it was Democrats have done really well in them. But I think that they have better opportunities, and I don't think that this state's going to be too competitive. I could be wrong. I think this could get interesting once we have a nominee. But Ashley Hinson, she did. She is an overperformer. She did really well in her final House race in 2024. She won her district by a safe margin, um, and I think that she's going to be fine for the state. In terms of the GOP's electability. So we'll see that. So Democrats right now they're at 44. Republicans are at 48. Actually, we have one more likely state, and that is Texas. Um, Texas is pretty much the most colossal. Just so this race is dependent on so many factors. I think you have primaries on both sides. You have John Cornyn, the incumbent senator, facing a primary from the right from Ken Paxton, the state's attorney general, and also now from Congressman Wesley Hunt, from who I think represents a Houston suburb. And then on the Democratic side, you have this huge battle between two newcomers to the party. You have Jasmine Crockett, who is, a member. I think she's a member of the Squad, um, and she is known for her inflammatory rhetoric. She jumped in at the last minute for the filing deadline. Colin Allred dropped out of the race unexpectedly. He ran against Ted Cruz in 2024. And James Tallarico is the other candidate, really, who's big name here. He is a bit of a newcomer. He's a state representative, and he's picked up a lot of traction with moderate Democratic voters. He's been he's gained a lot of recognition for his faith and the way he talks about Christianity, and his in his eyes the perceived hypocrisy of the GOP's view on Christianity. Um, and so I think overall, this primary for the Democrats is going to be pretty bloody. If it's in about a month, Texas has the is one of the first states in the nation to hold its primaries. I personally think Tallarico will probably win the primary. I think he's a lot more electable. Jasmine Crockett, I think a lot of the concerns about her candidacy are valid. I really do. I think that her the way that she talks and her rhetoric, and I think also just there's an impression that I think a lot of people get that she is all about herself, and I think that that's just really, you know and being a progressive black woman in Texas doesn't really bode super well for the conservative areas that you need to win in Texas. It's already a state that where Democrats really have to check the box in so many places, and I really don't think someone like Jasmine Crockett, who, you know, say what you want about her being unapologetic. If you like that, that's one thing. I'm not going to weigh in on that, but I think overall, in terms of electability, Tallarico, he's a bit of a firebrand as well. For the in terms of democratic, in terms of political positions, but he presents it in a way that's a lot more palatable, I think, to a lot of voters. And then but Crockett also could benefit. I mean, the Republicans are having a complete bloodbath. I think the Democrats, they're going to have a nominee by the end of March. Republicans look like they're going to May. They're going to a runoff, and Paxton in the beginning here before Hunt jumped in, he was leading Cornyn by a huge amount. Over the summer, I think Cornyn, he got a lot of national support. He got a lot of donations, and he really skyrocketed back into making this a competitive race. But Paxton has kind of lumped, he's jumped ahead again. But it's a much narrower lead. This race really just is the biggest, pardon my French, mindfuck that you could really ever imagine for a Senate race. And so I think if Ken Paxton's the nominee, the Republicans will have to worry a little bit about this race. But I really think even in a best case scenario for the Democrats, which I would imagine would be Ken Paxton versus James Tallarico, I still think Tallarico would have a really, 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 really hard time winning a state like Texas. This is a state that really Democrats just crashed in 2024. They've had some, there's been some signs. It's still the state that I would say had been, trending to the left. And I will say, I don't think it's trending right. I think it's kind of staying where it is right now. But the last couple of election cycles have just not been good for Democrats. I mean, Ted Cruz, I think Colin Allred would have done better in Texas had Ted Cruz, had Donald Trump not had such a strong performance against Kamala Harris. If Harris had done better, Allred could have made that a race. But I think Democrats here, they're talking about this as one of their potential pickups. And while I do think it's definitely more attainable than Nebraska, Iowa, and especially Florida, it's still Texas. It's really hard. So right now we are at 49 for the GOP. They only need one more because they have vice president is JD Vance, so he would break any ties. So if they win any of these 7 races, they've got it. Democrats need to win all of them. Uh, and I'm gonna give, where I'm gonna go to the lean Democratic states right now. We'll start with New Hampshire. Um, New Hampshire, I think this is a race where Democrats. This one, I think, along with Alaska, and in fact, we'll just get out of the way. I do think Republicans are going to hold on to control of the Senate, but I think these are the two races that are the most clear to me in terms of outcome right now. We'll start with New Hampshire. New Hampshire, Jeanne Shaheen, the Democratic senator from the state, she's retiring. She's decided not to run for a fourth time. Chris Pappas is pretty clearly going to be the nominee for the Democrats, and I think he's a good candidate. He has gotten a lot of progressive pushback for taking APAC money, but he has a lot of the states' endorsement. He has Jeanne Shaheen's endorsement, Maggie Hassan's endorsement. Um, and he's won in pretty competitive territory before. He beat Caroline Leavitt, the current White House press secretary, by a pretty large margin. He's leading in the primary polls by huge amounts. So while he's not necessarily having the primary all to himself, and he's taking crap for his APAC donations, he's still a really electable candidate, and he's been congressman for half the state for a long time, and I think I don't think he's in really any danger of losing this primary. Now on the Republican side, things are a bit more complicated. Scott Brown, who was a senator from Massachusetts and now lives in New Hampshire, he was an ambassador for Trump in his first administration. He is running for this seat again. He ran against Shaheen 12 years ago, didn't do too bad, but he's was perceived as a carpetbagger, and he lost. In a state, in a year where Republicans basically swept the vast majority of the competitive Senate seats. I mean, they did really well across the board here, and so New Hampshire was one of those states where they really kind of dropped the ball. Um, John Sununu, who was the senator that Shaheen beat for this state back, beat to win this seat back in 2008, I think he's running again, and he's got Senate Republican leadership's endorsement. He's basically endorsed by, I mean, Jesus, I think this is probably just about every Republican senator um, in the country. Maybe one or two are left off the list here, but he's pretty much got the establishment support. I do think he will be the nominee, but Scott Brown is still doing well. I think we'll have to see how Trump weighs in on this race, because Sununu has been a critic of Trump, just like his brother Chris Sununu, who was governor of New Hampshire not too long ago. Um, but he's got that Sununu named. I think he could be really, he could make this race really interesting. This is one of Republicans' best recruits for a Senate race in a while, especially in New Hampshire, where they've just been really kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel for the last couple cycles. I mean, they did win the governorship with Kelly Ayotte, who is now governor, who was a senator from the upper seat. But Chris Sununu pretty much doesn't really seem like he wants to be in electoral politics anymore, and I don't think his brother's as good of a politician. But he's held statewide office before. He's done this before, and I think that he's got um, the best chance to win the Senate seat out of anybody. And Chris Pappas, I think that we have two really strong candidates on both sides here. Meanwhile, in Alaska, Mary Peltola very recently entered this race. This is pretty much, a lot of people have been saying, Chuck Schumer really has gotten, the four seats that he really needs. He's gotten recruits, or gotten recruits in the four seats he really needs to win back the, Senate majority leaders. I wouldn't say gavel, but, I'll say it. The Senate Majority Leader's gavel. You have Roy Cooper, North Carolina, and Sherrod Brown, Ohio. Janet Mills in Maine, and Alaska. You have Mary Peltola. So I think Mary Peltola is a really good candidate. Dan Sullivan, I wouldn't necessarily call him a popular senator, but he's not. He's pretty non-controversial, and you know yes, he had a pretty close race in 2014, but that was against a pretty well-known Democrat, the first Democrat to win a Senate, a statewide election in Alaska in, I think, decades. I'm guessing, I'm pretty sure, or at least like a federal election in Alaska in decades. Um, and Sullivan had to, he went up against an incumbent here, Al Gross, 6 years ago, This was a race that some Democrats even thought, Ross could, flip. But Sullivan, he did better than Trump. And, granted, that was true for a number of Senate Republicans in 2020. But I think Sullivan was kind of, I think Sullivan did a lot better. It's understated how well he did here. And Mary Peltola, she's an amazing candidate, don't get me wrong. She still did really well in 2024, and Trump won the state by 13 points, so it was going to be hard for her to win anyway. And, especially against someone like Nick Begich, who's, who is related to that Mark Begich that I just showed you. But, party differences. I think Peltola still lost. She still lost, and I thought she was going to win. Trump, yes, did a bit better, but I think, it did a bit better than I expected and what most people expected, but, in terms of margin of victory, but, she still ended up losing that race. And I think when you see a lot of these polls, I genuinely believe Alaska is winnable for Democrats. Don't get me wrong. I think that her entry into this race is huge. It's huge for the party, but I think it would have been better, if she ran for governor because that's a more localized election. And she seems to really appeal that way. When I see her campaign launch video, she really focuses not on the national politics. She only talks about national politics in a very lamenting way. You know, she's really loves, you can tell that she's really passionate about Alaska. And so I think in terms of this race, yeah, she's going to give Dan Sullivan the fight of his life, but I think overall her energy probably could have been better spent in a Senate bid, in a governor's bid. But nonetheless, it was her decision, and I think Sullivan's going to have to fight. This is not going to be Al Gross. This is someone who is proven to do well in Alaska for a Democrat. um, but I think I would have a hard time seeing Sullivan lose here unless like something goes terribly wrong. He did, vote to extend the Obamacare tax credits, in December, um, before they expired, and I think he's got a good, well established, well of support in the base, and I think he's less controversial. He's the lesser known senator from the state rather than Murkowski, although voters also like her. But I think Alaska is a state where they really prefer that kind of traditional Republican. And yeah, he's a Trump guy, Sullivan, but I think he's also, he's from the pre-Trump era, and I think a lot of voters in Alaska like that. Anyways, I feel like I'm kind of rambling about Alaska, but overall, I think Sullivan's favored to win. I think just based on partisanship and the fact that this is, a Senate race. This is a nationalized race. But again, wonky things can happen in Alaska with Mary Peltola. So we'll see what happens. But I think honestly, her jumping from losing a House bid to jumping to a Senate bid, bit of a weird move, but certainly going to give Democrats something to be excited about. This video is running a little bit longer than I thought. I'm sorry about that, guys. I'll try and hurry it up here. Georgia, I'm gonna keep this. I can't remember if I had a lean or light or tilt in the last video, but John Ossoff raising boatloads of money, doing really really well. Democrats, had a decent performance here in 2024 compared to some of their other swing state losses, especially in the Rust Belt. This was a state that, um, compared to 2020, it voted, the amount that it voted to the right of the country actually shrank. It only voted like 1% to the right of the country. So this is a Democratic trending state. And Brian Kemp not running, I think, has really hurt the GOP here. I think Ossoff, this is a state where he's really going to be able to capitalize on the Obamacare tax credits being expired. And Republicans, they have a crowded primary here. I do think what's going to happen is Mike Collins will probably be the nominee, but we'll see. I think this primary is something that we're going to have to look. I'm going to be tracking the polling data for this race. I think we'll probably go to a runoff between Collins and Buddy Carter. I think Derek Dooley, he's endorsed by Brian Kemp, but he doesn't have the same name recognition, or the same, history electorally. He doesn't have the same institutional support as like Buddy Carter or Mike Collins, people who've served in the House. And I think Collins, he's got a lot of name recognition. He sponsored the Lincoln Riley Act, which was the first bill Trump signed into law in his second term. So I think he's a decent Senate candidate. But overall, I think any of these candidates, I mean, it's pretty clear Ossoff is the favorite here. Even Republican internals are showing him as the favorite. I mean, I think that this Ossoff really came to this, I really came into this cycle thinking Ossoff was one of the most endangered senators, and he very much still is. But since Kemp has decided not to run, I mean, this race has really just gotten really good for Democrats. And in fact, this past week, Sabato's crystal ball moved it to lean Democratic, which is just insane for a state like Georgia. Um, so overall, John Ossoff, I think, is the pretty clear favorite here right now. Um, I think that this state is really good for the Democrats. I think that it's close, it's very polarized, but Ossoff, I think, honestly, he's doing better than I expected. So the last lean state that I'm going to put here is Maine, and I think I'm going to get some pushback for this because Democrats definitely have a candidate here. They have a couple candidates running here, which was an issue the last time that I made a prediction for this video, or for the Senate. I think since then we've had Graham Plattner and Janet Mills jump into the race, and I think honestly I can't tell you which one that I think is going to win the primary. I would bet my money probably on Graham Plattner. I honestly don't know. I mean, it is so, as you can see here, the polls are just so all over the place. Um, I want more data, but I think in terms of who is more electable, the one that has the clear electoral history is Janet Mills. I do think that she has, despite her age, she has a really good chance at beating Susan Collins, and I think so does Graham Plattner. I think Susan Collins, this is going to be the closest election of her career, but at the same time, Democrats had a decent candidate in Sarah Gideon in 2020, and she still lost. She still lost, and she lost overwhelmingly. I think that people forget just how much of a failure this race was for the Democrats, despite Collins being so unbelievably unpopular, and despite her being tied to Trump and this race, and her basically not leading in a single poll. She won. And granted, there was, a third party here. So the fact, she only won 50% of the vote. So Democrats could have gotten a lot closer here. And I think they probably will this time. But I think it's hard to imagine to state just how badly this comparison, you look at how Trump did, and he just did horribly in Maine, overall. He lost it pretty overwhelmingly. But Collins, I think, just this was an example, I think, of how Susan Collins is unique, because you look at some of these other senators in 2024 who, or in 2018 who won in these, Trump states, but they weren't on the ballot on the same, at the same time as Trump. And when they were on the ballot, people like Sherrod Brown and John Tester, they lost. They lost by a lot less. They did really well in comparison to Kamala Harris, but they still were not able to make it. Susan Collins, on the other hand, she still won, and she won, with. I mean, I think that this was after ranked choice voting was instituted in Maine, so she had won less than a majority. She would have had to run again, or she would have had to. They would have had to do ranked choice voting and count. Who's the people's second choices. And so I think the only real way the Democrats win here in Maine, I think they got to get Collins under 40, get Collins under 50%. If they can do that, I think we have a race. But overall, I think Susan Collins, despite her unpopularity, is still an electoral juggernaut in this state. She has pulled off, it's truly shocking to me how well she did in 2020 and how much Maine likes to buck the establishment. So I think right now I'm going to give Maine to the GOP, regardless of if it's Janet Mills or Graham Plattner. I could see this race narrowing up in the coming months, but I think this is still a state that's pretty, clearly in the GOP column in my opinion. Ohio, I'm gonna put this. I would say this is a little bit, Maine's a little bit more competitive than Ohio, but John Husted, he's running against Sherrod Brown. I think Sherrod Brown, honestly, I was a little concerned that his candidacy maybe was not going to be as energetic as last time if he was going to do worse. But Houston, I don't know, the polls that I've been seeing, I haven't really paid that much attention to polling in this race, but Sherrod Brown seems to be doing okay. In polls. Obviously, Ohio has a history of overestimating Democrats in their polls. Um, but I think Brown did very well in 2024 compared to what he was given. He still did worse than what I expected because I didn't think Trump was going to win Ohio by, 13 points like he did, or not 13, but he won it by 11. But still, very impressive showing by Sherrod Brown. John Husted, he is an appointed incumbent, so that does, give him some, historically some less, a little bit less um, of an advantage, but he still has one statewide office in his own right. It has been a while since he's been on the ballot by himself, but I think he's going to be okay. This is still a red state. This is still a state that Republicans are going to make sure Democrats don't win. Um, this is still Ohio. If Sherrod Brown had won in 2024, he obviously would not be running for this race. Even if Republicans had won the White House, this race might not even have existed in an environment where Sherrod Brown had won in 2024, because Trump probably would have lost the election then. But I think Ohio, this is a state where Democrats have really lost a lot of white working class voters. Sherrod Brown can help win some of them back, but not enough. Not enough. I think there's a bit of a benefit. Vivek Ramaswamy, I don't think is going to be a fantastic candidate on, for the governorship here. I do think that um, that will be, a liability for the GOP, especially in a midterm environment where Trump's MAGA base probably won't come out in as great of numbers, but it's still Ohio. It's still a state that votes Republican. Um, in terms of the last two races, God, we're almost at 40 minutes. This is insane. Um, I forgot how long these videos can go. We have two races left here. Republicans have already won control of the Senate, but the question is, can Democrats, cut into their majority? And I believe they can. I think I'm going to give the two toss-ups to Democrats, Michigan and North Carolina. Let's start with Michigan. This state, I think, I would have this higher. And I would have this in a better position for the Democrats right now, because this state, compared to some of the others on this list, Democrats should be doing better. But the primary for them, I think, is killing them. I think it's really, really hurting their chances. Haley Stevens, Mallory McMurrow, Abdul El Said, they were all battling it out. Democrats did not have this problem in 2024 when they nominated Alyssa Slotkin. She cleared that field. And I think that the primary here, I mean, Haley Stevens has led pretty consistently, but there's still a lot of undecided voters. It looks like maybe Mallory McMurrow will, win the tide. We have gotten a little bit more clear polling here as of late. Emerson did do a poll, and they show Haley Stevens looks like she won by the largest amount in terms of who, or she beat Mike Rogers, the presumptive Republican nominee, by the most out of the free candidates. The only one who was not leading him actually was Abdul El Said. McMurrow underperformed Stevens by a couple of points in terms of her margin of victory, but I think right now it's a race between, Mike Rogers and whoever the Democrats nominate. Obviously, I think, Rogers has pretty much cleared. He's the only, candidate with major name recognition on, the, conservative side. Um, but and he did very well in 2024. He still lost the race, but he still put up a very strong performance against Alyssa Slotkin. It was pretty much, who was also a very strong candidate in her right, and I think that's part of why she was one of the four Democratic candidates in Senate races who who won in a Trump-backed state, or in a state that backed Trump at the same time. Michigan, you don't have that same swing district appeal in these races. I think Mallory McMurrow, she's won a red state senate district, and that's really good. But Haley Stevens, and that's not really the same as winning, a congressional district. But Haley Stevens is from a safe blue district. I think she used to be in a competitive district, but she was pretty average for a Democrat, I think. So, and I do think she's probably going to be the nominee as of right now, Stevens. I think McMurrow is definitely gaining on her. I think in terms of electability, McMurrow would be the best candidate to put up here for the Democrats. But Stevens has got a lot of corporate PAC support. She's got Senate leadership support, allegedly. I mean, there's not a direct endorsement like there is for Janet Mills in Maine, but it's pretty clear that Chuck Schumer wants Haley Stevens to be in the Senate. and I think that that's a mistake for the Democrats. I think that could cost them this race because of the Israel issue in Michigan. I don't think that that cost Kamala Harris the election in 2024. For in Michigan, but it definitely didn't help her chances. Arab voters did swing a lot, especially in Dearborn, Michigan. So, but I think overall, Stevens is just a little bit weaker than someone like McMurrow, who has won in a competitive district. But either way, I think the national environment will, and the fact that Republicans haven't won a Senate race in Michigan, and I want to say, I mean, how long has it been? It's been 30 years. It's been since 1994. I think that, Democrats are still going to keep up their winning streak here. North Carolina, the last state, this state, I think a lot of people are probably going to be like, why is this race so? Why are you being so nice to Michael Watley here? And the reason I'm being nice, or Watley, I think it's Watley, and the reason is because North Carolina, I think Roy Cooper is a phenomenal candidate. And while, and I think the rule, the usual, disclaimer that, a lot of, election forecasters give to former governors running in states that usually back the other party, um, I think Roy Cooper, this state is so close that I think Cooper genuinely really does just boost Republican or Democrats' chances. And I do very much believe that Cooper is the favorite, but I think in terms of, margin and in terms of just the state's history, North Carolina, it takes a lot for Democrats to win. On the state level, it's one thing, on the federal level, it's another. And I think Cooper he's raising boatloads of money, and Republicans were so tapped for a candidate after Tom Tillis dropped out, which was a huge blow to the Republicans here. I mean, if Tom Tillis was still in the race, I would very much consider him to probably honestly be the favorite against Cooper. I won't lie to you all. I think that Cooper would probably be a slight underdog here. So Watley, yes, he was chair of the North Carolina GOP. And while that's not while he's not necessarily on he's not necessarily someone who's really been chaired or what am I trying to say here? He's not necessarily someone who's been in elected office before, or someone who's been introduced to the voters before, but he knows how the state works, and I think he's learned to raise a lot of money. He's cleared the primary field pretty much. I think he's got like one, insurgent challenger. Yeah, Don Brown, but Don Brown's not really gonna get. He's got Mark Robinson's support, and Republicans, Watley's got Trump support. So I think it's the general election's pretty set here, but I do think Cooper, just having never lost an election in his more than 20 years and 20-year career in politics, I think he's pretty much the favorite. I would still be surprised if Cooper lost this race, but I do think it could happen. It's an underrated chance. The fact it's still a toss up. It's still a race that could go either way. I do have strong convictions that Cooper will still come out in the end, but in terms of chances and statistically speaking, I still think Michael Watley has got a very good shot here. And I think that it was strategic of the GOP in a state, where they weren't expecting to have a retirement to pull him in. So Cooper gives the Democrats their one pickup. They get 48 seats. Republicans get 52. So sorry for this video being so long, but yeah, Republicans overall, they hold on to the Senate. You know, they win. They more than easily win. They clearly hold on to the Senate. And the Democrats, but the Democrats, they don't lose too much ground either. They hold a number of competitive races and retirements. They win New Hampshire, Minnesota, Michigan. They do okay. They come up short in Texas, but they do, and Ohio and Maine and Alaska, but they do okay. And they win North Carolina. So overall, I think that this is where this Senate map stands. Not too much of a change from my last prediction, but still, these races are getting really interesting. I want to see if any of this changes. I think that this map is probably the most. I mean, I don't know. This 2024 Senate map was pretty stagnant, if we're being honest here. But I think in terms of races rating changes that I would give, down, the line, I'm really interested to see how all these races fluctuate in the coming months. I'm anticipating to give Michigan a more friendly Democratic score once we have a clear nominee, but again, that's not going to happen for several months. And by the time that happens, I mean, Democrats could very well still be in a very, they're still going to have to really fight for this race. I'm really interested to see how Maine goes in all of these races. So let me know what y'all think in the comments down below. Who do you think is going to win the Senate this year? Do you agree with some of my predictions? Do you think Democrats are going to do worse, or do you think they're going to do better? Do you think they're actually going to win Maine or Alaska or Ohio or even Texas? Let me know. I'm so excited to be starting, kicking off this year with a Senate election, prediction, and to do my, biennial duty, of giving you guys an idea of where I think these elections are going to go in an unbiased way. So thank you all for watching. Share this video with someone who you think would enjoy it. Subscribe for more content, and I'll see you guys next time when I talk about all things politics. See ya.